Daily Bible Time, Dominic Steele, and we're in day 2 on a 22-day journey through Christopher Watkin's Biblical Critical Theory. Chris Watkin, he's going to be my first guest on the Pastor's Heart in the new year, and I have read a fair bit of it. I don't think everything went in on my first read through his book, so I'm reading it again in place of my regular Bible reading for these 22 days. I began it on holidays a few weeks ago, but I've just decided to go through it again and in the process summarise it here for you. I thought that would be helpful for me and perhaps helpful for you if you're reading along as well. And look, I do want to encourage the engaged thinkers at Village Church to read along Watkin's book with me. I think it's going to be good for all of our souls. One of the reading hacks that I've come up with on this book, just to make the process more digestible, is as you get to each chapter, go to the end of the chapter and look at the discussion questions at the end of the chapter before reading the chapter. And so when you think, these are the things he wants you to discuss after reading the chapter, you think, they're the key takeaways he wants me to take. I'll look out for them on the way through. So as we do chapter 2, the discussion questions that Christopher Watkin gives at the end of the chapter are: 1, what difference does it make that the universe has a beginning? Why is the creator-creature distinction important for Christian understanding of reality? How do biblical ideas of transcendence and immanence differ from the extra-biblical namesakes, from their extra-biblical namesakes? And in what ways is tohu wabohu of Genesis 1 a cultural and natural threat today? Now, tohu wabohu means formless. Tohu means formless, and bohu means empty. I'll come back to that question. The second reading hack is fairly simple. It's just to work out what are the major headings in the chapter, and the ones in capitals and in slightly larger text, they're the big headings, and so they tend to be the ones that relate to the biblical framework, the Bible plotline, and then there are smaller headings which are relating to the engagement with the conversation partners, primarily the other philosophers, as we go through. So in this creation chapter, the big headings are: in the beginning God, formless and empty, and God said, every and all. God saw that it was good, and on the seventh day God rested. Now you think, okay, familiar ground. They're the kinds of headings I'd expect on creation in Genesis 1. Let's dive in. In the beginning, God. Firstly, Watkin says there was a beginning. If there was a beginning, then the universe is not necessary. It would be possible for the universe, for us, not to exist. And, in the beginning God, it was God who began things. Watkin says Genesis 1 is a single block on the bottom row of the Bible's Jenga tower. If this one truth is removed or neglected, then the whole edifice comes crashing down. The first verse of the Bible is the foundation for everything else. He then goes on. Watkin looks at the other creation accounts, and there's just violence and conflict, blood, gore and conflict. He also notes that the creation myths, both ancient and modern, cosmic and social, tend to the agnostic, whereas in contrast, Genesis 1 spares us violence and conflict. There's no one for God to be in conflict with. There's no rival to play the antagonist to God's grand creation plan. Rather, Genesis 1 is calm, ordered, no one gets hurt, and the universe is created by God in peace through speaking. What we see in Genesis 1 is a clear distinction between creator and creation. And Watkin points out the fundamental distinction in our universe is not between God and the devil, but rather between creator and creation. Cornelius Van Til. He says, the Bible contains a theory of reality, and this reality is that of two levels of being: God as infinite, eternal, and unchangeable, and of the universe as derivative, finite, temporal, and changeable. You contrast Van Til with Carl Sagan, who said, the cosmos is all that is, or ever was, or ever will be. Now, so you have a creator-creature distinction, and Watkin points out the implication is there's no metaphysical mediator between God and creation. There are no rival gods. God is not just a bigger version of us. He is other to all other creatures. Now, that discussion question: how do the biblical ideas of transcendence and immanence differ from their extra-biblical namesakes. Now, something is transcendent if it exists or operates beyond the universe. Something is immanent if it is indwelling or inherent if it exists or operates within the universe or within our experience. And Watkin reminds us that since Immanuel Kant, Western thought has considered the transcendent to be mysterious, unknowable, absolutely other, and Western thought has seen the immanent as accessible, known, and virtually indistinguishable from the rest of our experience. And if you follow that, you end up with a God who, if transcendent, he's so other to us that we can have precious little idea of what he, she, it, them is like. Or if you have a God who is immanent, well, that God dissolves into our everyday lives and becomes indistinguishable from anything and everything else. So those gods, they won't bother us, but they won't satisfy us. But Watkin says the Bible does not understand transcendence and immanence in that way. Rather, in the biblical picture, the main reason for God's transcendence is his holiness. And the biblical understanding of God's immanence is not to assert that he is like us, but rather to assert that he is intimately involved in his world. For the unbiblical view, if God is transcendent, then we can't say anything about him. But for the biblical view, if God is transcendent, we cannot approach him because he's holy. For the unbiblical view, if God is immanent, then we can't distinguish him from others. But for the biblical view, if God is immanent, then we cannot escape his love and care. So, summary at this point in the chapter, the universe is not necessary. God does not need a universe. And we are, as his creation, Acts chapter 17, in every way dependent on God. And he is in no way dependent on us. And then, well, that really, in the creation chapter, is the first demonstration of grace. God didn't need to do it, and we're dependent on him. Then, wow, God's generosity, God's graciousness. Key line from Watkin: I cannot overstress how fundamental and distinct this figure is to a Christian view of reality. The idea that the universe is not necessary and that everything flows from that observation about the character of God and the nature of humanity and the world, it blows apart and rearranges so many of the social and political assumptions of later modernity. The core of the doctrine of creation is not the fact that the world came into existence, but that it did not need to come into existence. And that paradigm shift of thinking puts us in the posture of recipients. Watkin goes on to note that modern philosophy looks for logical certainty, and yet that is flummoxed by this concept of generosity. There's a section then on the contrast between the without God view of the universe. The universe is not a gift, there's no giver. The universe is a product of causes that are mostly opaque to us. We're all on the same level as everything and everyone else, and you end up with the paradigm of the market, where I come to you, you come to me, we're both needy, we're trying to satisfy each other's needs, there's some trade of mutual benefit. And that market paradigm, that makes everything, including love, security and identity, something that can be traded, a contract, a deal for personal benefit. Our relationship with our families, our partners, the world we live in, are in the end all business deals. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And the only intervention into that market is chance. So you've got necessity, obligation and chance. Now, you contrast that with the biblical view. The Bible view makes a mockery of all of that. The Bible's picture of humanity is not of us as wheelers and dealers in a corporate boardroom. Rather, we are joyful children on Christmas morning, getting unexpectedly lavish gifts from our parents. Free gift, not contractual obligation. And that gives us a pattern for society of helping the needy when they've got no means to pay back. The with God view with grace, we have starting position, we are receivers of a priceless gift that makes our primary disposition to the world one of thanksgiving and praise. Now, next big heading, the world was formless and empty before God said, let there be light, a dark, silent void, in the Hebrew, tohu wabohu. in the Bible and in our world, well, that's a threat. This formless and empty, this monster of chaos, tornadoes, tsunamis, deforestation. Shorthand for the worst nightmare of social disintegration. Watkin looks at late modernity's take on this through the eyes of Samuel Beckett in a play with a picture of grey nothingness. Beckett sees in the greyness despair and gallows humour, whereas God sees in the nothingness, in the chaos, a blank canvas. God is not constrained by the circumstances. God takes the nothing, the chaos, and speaks a universe into existence and sees that it is good. Next one, the line, and God said. Watkin points out that in the wake of Plato and Aristotle, Western philosophy has framed the Supreme Being as a thinker rather than a speaker. Thoughts are private contemplation, whereas words are public communication, and communication implies community and relationship. God speaks the universe into existence. That sets a pattern. God's words bring life. Now, there's an interesting section on God speaking the universe into being and implications from that for language and reality that we're going to skip over. I'm going to come to the heading now, every and all. The heading, every and all, God creates everything. Every, all is emphasized again and again in creation in Genesis 1. God gives to Adam rule over all, and God sees all as very good. And Watkin's point is that God's creation is not minimalist. God's creation is superabundant excess. God has not just created a world with just enough sustenance, variety, and abundance for survival. I was just thinking about spaceships and movies of spaceships. This is not in his book, this was just my thought, and how they have minimalist provisions. But God, you eat out of a tube or something, but God has created a superabundant world to foster the flourishing of his creatures. And that is both functional and beautiful. A world that functions in a symphony of order and creativity. Now, complete order is monotone, but unfettered creativity is the white noise of chaos. And God's universe functions on the sweet spot of this spectrum, where order does not drain creativity, and creativity does not destroy order. Now, next big heading, and it was good. That is said again and again in Genesis 1, and that takes us, says Watkin, to Western thought, René Descartes and Immanuel Kant. And with Descartes, you can't be sure of any of your impressions of the outside world, so you couldn't be saying it was good. You couldn't be making that assessment. For Kant, in his critique of pure reason, the distinction between the subjective and objective is dug deeper still. Kant argues, I'm just quoting Watkin here, and philosophers have found it exceedingly hard to prove him wrong, that the categories of my experience of the world, such as space and time, are in fact not properties of the world out there. Instead, they're features of my understanding, ways that my mental apparatus makes sense of things. I've no direct access to the things in themselves, only the things as they are for me. Now, here's what Watkin says Genesis 1 does here. For Genesis 1, all reality is indeed interpreted, but the authoritative interpreter is God. See, if I say I saw it as good and you say I saw it as evil, who can arbitrate between us? But a third person who sees whether it's good or evil. But when God says he sees it as good, he sees it rightly, because it expresses his own good character and purpose, and because there's no greater reality to which his estimation has to measure up. God's words bring the universe into being. God's words uphold it second by second. And to what could we appeal to disagree with God's view of things? How God sees things simply is how they are, because apart from him, there is nothing at all. And the chapter finishes with a section on, and God rested. And we're going to leave that for you to read. Thanks for joining us on Daily Bible Time for this journey through Watkin's biblical critical theory